Good afternoon and welcome to the fourth session of the Developing Developers webinar series that is co-hosted by South African PV Industry Association and the South African Wind Industry Association, supported by the IPP office, REEF and BEPA. Today's session is proudly sponsored by Mainstream Renewable Power and Juvi, and we are grateful to our sponsors, series sponsors for that. This particular session is proudly sponsored by ED Platform, and we are also grateful for the sponsorship. Today we're discussing economic development impact of the renewable energy project. So as you remember, those who've been with us from the beginning of the series, we started with first understanding the REEF RFP, and then we went on to discuss the legal outlook, discussing contracts and partnerships, and then we went on to discuss the financial outlook, and now we are on the fourth episode where we're discussing the economic impact of the sector. I'm joined by a panel of very good speakers, people who've got a lot of experience in the in the renewable energy industry, and who have worked in the economic development space for quite a long time. And we are grateful for our speakers for agreeing to share their knowledge in today's session. I would just like to request all participants that as we go through, please post your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. And also you can post questions in the chat function as well. And we will collect the questions and then we will answer them, pose them to the speakers at the end of the session. So how the session is going to run, we will start with a presentation from ED Platform, presented by Joshua Golden. And then he will give us an outline of the ED-SED scorecard as it appears in the REEF program RFP documents. As we know it, by the way, and I think big disclaimer there is we are not talking about round 5 because we haven't seen the RFP document, but we're talking about the REEF program as we know it up to today. And then the next presentation will be on enabling high-impact socio-economic development projects, and will be done by Yumna Firfey from Scatec Solar. And then the next presentation will focus on enterprise development initiatives, and presented by Hlengwe Debe from Globelec. And then the final presentation by Francis Jackson from Green Cape, looking at the localization opportunities within the renewable energy value chain. And then in the end, I will hand over to Niveshan Govender, the COO of the SAPVIA, and who will run the Q&A session and take us to the closing remarks. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker. Next slide, Marilis. Thank you. Our first speaker, as I said, is Joshua Golden from ED Platform. He is the head of reporting at ED Platform. He has been involved in economic development reporting unit for quite some time. And prior to joining ED Platform, Joshua was a researcher at the Financial and Fiscal Commission. He has a master's degree in economic science from the University of Witwatersrand. He is interested in data management and manipulation and creation of models. So as Joshua is responsible for reporting, he deals with a lot of data, and we look forward to hear from him what exactly is required in the building documents when it comes to ED scorecard. So over to you, Joshua. We're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ntombi. I think I just wanted to start first by thanking SAPVIA and SAWEA and our sponsors for giving me this opportunity to talk to everyone, just to, first of all, I think just have a look at what ED Platform does in this space, and then to talk about things relating to the economic development scorecards and the kinds of things that we've seen over time and presently what we're seeing at the moment. So I think if we can go to the next slide. So just a little bit about what we as ED Platform do. We are an economic development advisory company, and traditionally we've been involved with your large-scale renewable energy infrastructure. So we're talking about your large PV power plants and wind farms, a little bit of concentrated solar power and some hydro. But we're moving towards, we're moving outwards, and we're looking at a few more areas now. Some of them are, it's small scale embedded generation, and we're also doing some work on just transition, which I think is very important as we move from, you know, a fossil fuel dominated energy structure towards renewables. Just making sure that, you know, we move in the spirit of economic development, and that, you know, people aren't left behind. And, you know, so those are the kinds of things that we're branching off into, in addition to the economic development we work with in the renewable space. So just a little bit more in terms of our function in the economic development process. So we're in it pretty much from inception. So at the beginning of the process, we're involved in the tendering process. And during the tender process, a potential bidder has to put forward economic development commitments, which ultimately pull through towards the execution phase. And whatever commitments they put forward ultimately get encapsulated within the implementation agreement, which is finalized during commercial close and financial close. So typically at commercial close, we sign off on the implementation agreements and the power purchase agreements. But at financial close, we set up the profile, the timing of all the economic development obligations that an IPP has to commit to. And we follow through with that in terms of the execution and the reporting. These IPPs have to report to the department on a quarterly basis. And this is for the construction period and for the operating period, which is 20 years. So, you know, when you're entering the process in terms of tendering a project, you're looking at a minimum 20-year period of economic development commitments and development for communities that need it and people that need it for the next 20+ years. So we've been involved in these kinds of processes all the way from the beginning, from bid window 1 all the way until the expedited bidding window. We've also been involved with some of the small IPP programs. So that's typically your projects that are smaller than 5 megawatts. And currently we're working on the risk mitigation program. So I'm gonna speak a little bit about the risk mitigation program when we reach the end of the presentation. But yeah, this has been a process that ED Platform has been involved with since the beginning. I think if we can move to the next slide, Ntombi. This visual is just to give you an indication of our footprint in the renewables market. We've done work for, well over 60 projects, and we've serviced over 50% of the market. And we expect to keep on going from the risk mitigation program and beyond. So I think we can go to the next slide. So I think the main purpose then of this webinar was to give an idea of what is economic development in terms of the renewable energy independent power producer programs. Of what are we making commitments to? So on the screen, you've got the 7 elements of economic development, and each of them is broken up into a few subcomponents. So we can start off with job creation. And when it comes to job creation, we are looking at the employment and development of South African people, the development of Black South African people, And there's also a strong focus on employing people who reside within the areas surrounding the project sites. So I'm sure that most viewers are aware that the locations of these renewable energy projects, even if we just look at the Northern Cape, there's a lot of need for development and a lot of need for opportunities. So, you know, all aspects of economic development, but specifically job creation is tailored to developing people and giving people opportunities in these communities. And the last element of job creation is the employment of Black skilled people. So there's we're trying to develop Black South Africans with the skills that we need to carry on and increase their exposure to these levels of infrastructure so that we can increase these employment opportunities. The second element is local content, which is interested in local manufacture. So we're looking for, to try and increase the percentage of local manufacture when it comes to key components in these renewable energy infrastructure projects, and also the provision of local services. So, but a strong emphasis on trying to get that manufacturing process locally sourced. The third element then is ownership, and in this case, I mean, it's quite straightforward. We're trying to get higher percentages of Black shareholding in the companies that they set up for the renewables program, and also in the contractors. So there'll be contractors for the construction and the operating periods, and there's a strong emphasis on getting higher and higher levels of Black shareholding in these companies. The fourth element is management control, and this is interested in getting Black people into the top management structures with a large emphasis on getting Black females into top management. So the way that these programs are scored ultimately in terms of management control, they'll get good points if they can show that they're going to have Black females in their management structure. The fifth element is preferential procurement, and this, while it's interested in increasing BBBE procurement as a whole, it also looks to offer opportunities for small companies, so companies that have a turnover of less than 50 million rand annually, and also to give opportunities to companies that are owned by women. So preferential procurement is, the main driver is to give opportunities to these smaller woman-owned companies. And then when we look at the last two, enterprise development and socioeconomic development, these are also focused primarily within the communities surrounding the projects. We're looking at developing people and developing small Black-owned companies in those areas. And the socioeconomic development that we see typically encompasses things like your education and social welfare and healthcare. Those are the typical things that we are looking at in terms of giving people opportunities and giving small Black-owned companies opportunities in these communities, again, to potentially get them exposure outside of these particular projects that they may be working on. And Tommy, we can carry on. Yeah, we can go. Yeah, thank you. So it's one slide back. So at ED Platform, our slogan is economic development beyond compliance, and that really encapsulates what we've been discussing in terms of these economic development elements. And we're looking, these things are encapsulated within the NDP and the kinds of social and economic challenges that we see in South Africa. We know that we have issues with employment. We know that we have issues in terms of manufacturing some of these things locally. And these economic development elements are an issue of compliance when we're talking about the renewables energy program. but we really want to push that and push it beyond just compliance so that we can see change happening in, and seeing the kinds of changes that we want, especially in terms of employment and giving people those opportunities. We can go to the next slide, thanks. So we just then wanted to cover a few of the kinds of things we've seen over the years, ranging from round one. And I mean, the first thing that we note is that we've seen generally a significant increase in the kinds of obligations, specifically in terms of job creation, ownership, top management, and preferential procurement. We've seen quite significant commitments being made to these elements, even especially in round four. We've seen very high levels of top management in terms of, having your management structure being comprised of Black women, which is something great that we've seen. And job creation as well, the kinds of commitments that have been made, not only on a percentage basis, but on an actual quantum basis, actual jobs that are committed. We've seen these things increase, and it's been really amazing to see over the years. One of the adverse impacts in terms of the delays that we've seen, there was around a 4-year delay between the round 4 bidders being announced and the actual financial close. And I mean, in that process and in that time period, just one of the adverse outcomes we've seen is some impacts on the ability to get good local content, which is it's unfortunate. But in terms of shifts, what we've seen, as I mentioned now, job creation, quantum obligations, what we've seen from round 3 onwards is that the department, as part of the process, has actually put in these quantum obligations for job creation that have become binding in the implementation agreement, which I think it was fantastic, because it meant then that any percentages that you committed to, and it typically is a percentage that you commit to, IPPs were now being held to quantums and to employing the levels of people that they said that they were going to employ at bid stage. And that's something significant, and it's again something we've seen coming through in the reporting process for the round 4 projects. I think if we can go to the next slide. So then just our last little bit of the presentation is just got to do with market signals. In terms of, again, what we're seeing currently, and a lot of this has come not only from the coal IPP program, but from the risk mitigation program that's happening now. We're seeing additional elements coming into the economic development space. And it's also something that's wonderful to see, that we're expanding the kinds of initiatives that we can do and the kinds of programs that we can offer in terms of economic development. And just to highlight some of the elements that have been added into the program, there are now obligations to do local content spend in the operating period. So up until now, the obligation to achieve local content commitments has only been in the construction period. And to see this now in the operating period, it's, we're expecting to see some good things in that regard. They've also added some obligations in terms of skills development. So in addition to your socioeconomic development, there are additional requirements now to get skills development programs going. And that's also, that's just something fantastic to see. And finally, they've also implemented some supplier development commitments. And that's quite different from your enterprise development commitments, because your enterprise development commitments are not primarily focused on small Black-owned suppliers that form part of your value chain. They typically fall outside of the value chain within the communities. Supply development is now looking at actual small Black-owned companies that are within your supply chain. And that again just gives these companies opportunities and learning outcomes that they can then apply and move on, and not necessarily provide services just to, energy infrastructure, but beyond that. And that's ultimately the end of my presentation. Again, I think thank you for giving me the opportunity to cover this information in terms of economic development. And I look forward to getting questions and answering those. But again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Josh. It's been great. I particularly liked the point when you say economic development beyond compliance, because I think this is one point where we always think that we need to demonstrate impact of our ED activities in the communities. And I think we are not yet at that point, but as a sector, we need to jointly figure out how are we going to measure the impact and actually not just report the spend, but also report on what impacts are we making in those communities. So thank you very much for your time. I know that it's a busy period for you and you have to dial out. We'll collect your questions and we'll post them to you. Perhaps you can respond to them by email. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
All right. Our next speaker was going to talk about impact of enabling high impact socioeconomic development projects. I think building on what Josh has already outlined is Yuma Firfey. And she is currently the head of sustainability of Scatec Solar, and she has had a diverse career in business, government, and partnership organization as an entrepreneur in South Africa and abroad. She has worked in the areas of enterprise development, tourism, design, sustainability, and renewable energy. She's also responsible for establishment of the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership, and has won various awards in the business and government. As you can see, Yumna is quite an esteemed leader in the sector, and we are grateful to have her share her experiences in the socio-economic development space. Over to you, Yumna.
Thank you so very much, Ntombi, and good afternoon. And thank you for the opportunity to be part of this webinar. So I'm going to be talking about how we enable high impact socioeconomic development. But I thought before we do that, we can move on to the next slide. Maybe a word on why before we talk about how. Although I won't really be talking about why, I'd like to leave this for the Q&A for anyone who's interested. I also have been very much struck, Ntombi, by what Joshua said around ED beyond compliance, because I think a lot of us focus on compliance because it's what we have to do, or we think about SED, socioeconomic development, because it's the right thing to do. So it's either because we have to do it or because it's the right thing to do. But I'd actually like to offer during the Q&A possibly 2 good business reasons why it's the right thing to do. So not only from a social perspective, but also from your very own business perspective, why it's the right thing to do. But I won't be talking about that right now. So let's move on to the next slide and we can talk about how. So from our perspective as Scatec, and we are no longer Scatec Solar, we are moving beyond just solar to various forms of renewable energy. So watch this space. In early Jan, we will launch our new branding. For now, our slides have Scatec Solar, but I'll be referring to ourselves as Scatec. So as Scatec, we have 3 rules that we look at in terms of creating a high impact SED. And the first one is be strategic. Second one, there's nothing to read. How do we collaborate, integrate, and communicate? And thirdly, think big. So let's move on to how can we be strategic, and we can go on to the next slide. From our perspective, a few years ago, we overhauled our 20-year vision of community development. And you can actually click through to the next transition. Thank you very much. And we call this our integrated community development strategy. In essence, we thought about, from the community needs assessment that we had done with our different communities, we thought about what would we like year 20 to look like, And what are the different images or visions that we have of thriving communities? And when we put these into themes, we basically arrived at 5 themes. And those are the ones that you're seeing on the slide right now: education, youth development, local economy, well-being, and community visioning. And what you see in each of those little blocks are the objectives that we'd like to achieve in each of those themes. And those objectives are defined by the problem statements that came out of a community needs assessment. So from the problem statements, we then converted these then into objectives, and that's what you're seeing in front of you. We can now go on to the next slide, because we've then looked at the objectives and we converted the objectives into, and I'll just wait for those transitions to happen so you can click through. Thank you very much. We then converted those objectives into programs. So from what we want to achieve in year 20, how do we work backwards into programs now in the short term, medium term, and long term to be able to achieve those 20-year objectives and those outcomes, that vision for our community that we'd like to achieve. So that speaks broadly to how are we being strategic, how are we thinking long-term into the future, and how are we then taking that vision for the future and rolling that forward to the present in terms of what we do now. And of course, that includes doing monitoring and evaluation, having an M&E framework to be able to assess that we are on track with regard to what we want to achieve. We can now move on to the next rule, which is collaborate, communicate, and integrate. So we can go on to the next slide as well, please. Yes, and even on to the next one. And an important part of collaborating is partnering with communities. In fact, we looked at 5 different types of partnerships, but I'm only going to focus on 3 of them right now. And one of them is partnering with communities, and we can move on to the next slide, which then looks at how we do partner with communities and how we do that. I think you've moved 2 up, maybe just 1 up. There we go, wonderful. Right. And the most important way that we have chosen to integrate and to communicate and partner with communities is through our stakeholder engagement forums, as we fondly call them SEFs. So what are our stakeholder engagement forums? You've seen the 5 themes that I've shown you in the previous slides. In each of those, for each of those 5 themes, we have an SEF, a stakeholder engagement forum in each of the communities. So take, for example, education. We'll have an SEF for education in each of our communities, and we'll have the relevant stakeholders and knowledgeable partners to be part of those SEFs. So it would typically be ECD practitioners, education NGOs, teachers, principals, our community liaison officers, our CLOs, and ourselves. And in that education SEF, we'll talk about what do we need to do around education in order to achieve our 20-year vision. And when we started off this process, in the very first SEF that we had, we asked the question, what is currently happening? Where are we at? What are our challenges? What do we need to do more of? What are we not doing well at all as a community? And where would you prefer SCOTIC to be playing a role in order to be able to achieve our 20-year vision? So this has been really powerful. And in fact, before we even started our SEFs, we were advised by the municipality to have a town hall meeting where we explained to the community that this is how we would like to engage with them as partners in economic development and socioeconomic development and community building. And the response by the community was absolutely so encouraging. They told us that for them, this is like a 1994 moment or the next moment after 1994, because in 1994, they were allowed to vote, or we were all allowed to vote for the government of the day. But through these SEFs, they have been empowered to actually be involved in nation building, starting with their own communities. And that was amazing. That's not what we expected, but they really took to it and they were very excited about these SCFs. So what we are able to achieve through the SCFs is understanding community needs, involving them in decision-making, and then as a result, having much more robust and relevant socioeconomic development programs. We also potentially see this as a vehicle to transfer skills, project management, cash flow management to the SCF, people that are part of the stakeholder engagement forums. And what we have started now as well, in addition to those hard skills, is a personal development program called Free to Grow. And we've just started that last month. And we've managed to attend the first session. And this was so exciting because our SCF conveners, so for every SCF, we also have about 3 to 5 people that convene the SCF, so that when we are not there, together with the CLOs, they can do planning on their own. And it's a wonderful way of empowering community to take their future into their own hands and empower them to be able to do that. And we were able to attend this first session of Free to Grow, and it was wonderful to see people start talking about their emotions, how they're feeling, their aspirations. And you realize that living in very difficult circumstances where you're living day to day, you don't have the luxury to talk about how you're feeling. You don't have the luxury to talk about the trauma you're experiencing or where you'd like to be heading towards. So it was really wonderful to see people opening up and to sharing their plans and their dreams for the future, and realizing as well that those dreams are so congruent with each other, and for them to be able to see that they were heading in the same direction meant that people could start building partnerships. And in fact, that's one of the intended outcomes of these SCFs, is building a culture of partnership, a sense of agency, local leadership, stronger institutions, and an appreciation of democracy. We can now move on to the next type of partnership. And the first one was partnership with the community. This one is partnership within Scotec Solar, or within Scotec, and the industry, and how we do this for local skills, jobs, and entrepreneurship. And please move on to the next slide. And how we've done this is through our Construction Industry Development Program, or CIDP. And CIDP has been a way of us looking at how we can support the construction industry. We started off in 2018 looking at the supply side, understanding our construction SMMEs better. We then moved last year to look at the demand side, understanding the market or the buyers of construction SMMEs better, the public works departments, construction companies that use construction SMMEs as subcontractors, various buyers, other IPPs. So that's what we did last year. And this year we're starting with phase 3, which is using that knowledge of supply and demand and the gap between the two to be able to develop our construction SMMEs. And we've started this process a while back before, but not as informed as we are now. We can move on to the next slide. And essentially through this process, we are hoping to deepen and widen participation in the construction sector by more people, and specifically more people, more local entrepreneurs from our communities. So, and by doing this, we can help people to meaningfully participate. Of course, this means collaboration. It means we need to collaborate with other IPPs. We need to collaborate with Department of Public Works. We need to collaborate with education. I'll explain why we need to do that later. But we also need to collaborate within our own organization. So, you know, it's not just automatic that we develop and we support an SMME and they form part of our supply chain. We actually need to collaborate with our supply chain. We need to collaborate with our O&M, our operations and maintenance department, to understand what their needs are, what their standards are, and make sure that our SMMEs fit into that. And Joshua spoke earlier about the new requirements around supply development. And this is exactly that, is how do we do supplier development as part of our SED in order to feed into our supply chain and to use our local entrepreneurs. Maybe just before you move on to the next slide, just still on the previous slide, we also are seeing, not only how we feed our entrepreneurs, our construction SMEs into the official construction supply chains, but also how we do SED and at the same time. And this speaks to the integration angle. So we're looking at currently we're looking at how do we upgrade educational infrastructure. And when we do this, we want to do this in a way where we also bring our construction SMEs into that process. So that speaks to the integration angle. Thank you. We can now move on to the next slide. And here follows on from economic and social integration. And so when we do SED, we also try to do ED at the same time. So as much as possible, our programs aren't programs that just stand alone. We try to integrate our programs with each other. And if we move on to the next slide, I can give you some examples of how we do that. So I love this program because it is such a simple program, such a simple initiative. That one of the, there've been lots of disadvantages of COVID, but one of the positives coming out of this year is that is our face mask production. So we could have just, and many other IPPs have done this as well. We've done this as a partnership in many cases. We could have just purchased face masks from anywhere in South Africa or from outside of South Africa, heaven forbid. And we could have supplied these to the vulnerable members of our community. We chose the vulnerable and we chose the learners going back to school to make sure that they're safe. So we could have just supplied it. Instead, what we try to do is we encourage face mask production amongst the sewing co-ops within our communities. And yes, this started the economic recovery process, and we know that this is a real key objective during this period as our economy is shrinking in dangerous ways. But more than that, what we found is I've got two wonderful examples, personal examples. The one is one woman, because she earned some money with the face mask production, this was the first time that she had money of her own. It was also the first time that she was asked to open up her own bank account. So she opened up her own bank account and she had money of her own. And this is incredibly powerful for a woman in a small town or a rural community. Another personal example that our CLO just shared with us this week is someone who could only do needlework, couldn't use a machine, learned to use a sewing machine, did some face masks, earned some money, could buy some things for a mother that in the home that they never had before. And then, this is the exciting part, she then used the money to do some security training and to get a security certificate. And a few weeks later, after that, she was able to find full-time employment. Now that is the power of local economic development and integrating social with economic. And I thought this was just a small thing that we would do is have local face mask production. But you can see just the kinds of potential that something like this can encourage in the community. Okay, we can now move on to the next area. And this is assistant teachers that we also developed. We started the process actually before COVID because there was an increase in the requirement of remedial teachers. We provided some assistant teachers in a number of schools, but because of COVID, this became even more valuable because as children were returning to school, with very few of them having access to online learning, the assistant teachers came into the space and provided much needed educational support. And then we also funded school cleaners. And again, this is integrating the social and the economic. Both the assistant teachers and the school cleaners, we increased the number of jobs in the community, but at the same time, they were playing a very important social role as well. We can then move on to the next slide. And this is the self-defense classes. I think I'm probably going to run out of time, so I won't deal with this right now. We can always come to this later on. But let's move on to the third rule, which is in the next slide, and that is think big. And if there's time, we can return to the slide. So the next slide will look at the third rule that that I've suggested we have as SCARTIC, and this is how do we think big. So number one was strategic, be strategic. Number two was collaborate, communicate, and integrate, which I've just spoken about right now. And the third one is think big. And we can move on to the next slide. And let me explain what has happened here. So we H1 Holdings, Scaled Impact, Democracy Works, formed a partnership to do some research in the Northern Cape, and they applied to the IDC for a grant, which they were successful in receiving at the beginning of this year. And they started a very exciting research project to look at how do we have more catalytic projects in the Northern Cape. And this is about thinking big. So not just doing some of the small projects, which are very valuable, but how do we actually set in motion something that can be quite transformative? And what they've come up with, they've just presented their final presentation early this week. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the sources of regional economic value. And Joshua started off talking about how there is inadequate economic activity in the Northern Cape. But the Northern Cape actually has immense resources that are underexplored. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see things such as the Northern Cape has the largest zinc reserves in the world. It's a historically copper mining region. Going down that list, 80% of the world reserves in fluorspar are in the Northern Cape. But these, of course, are underexplored. And if we look on the right-hand side of the screen, we see potential economic applications if we had to explore these opportunities further. So zinc mining, zinc air batteries, zinc alloys, copper cables, etc., etc. So there's a lot of opportunities that we can actually look at. But if we move on to the next slide, you'll see that these would require quite hefty investment. So if you look at zinc batteries, for example, I mean, that's in excess of 10 billion. Some of the projects are slightly smaller. So some projects as SCARTIC, we might be able to do on our own with trust money and SED money, but very many of them we would only manage to do if we, speaking to the previous rule, if we collaborated with other IPPs, with the IDC, if we communicated, if we integrated our programs. But this is the potential if, as IPPs, we were able to think big, not just thinking about what we can do, not just thinking about how we do things, to your words, Joshua, around just compliance, but how, if we went beyond compliance, we'd be able to make an absolutely transformative difference in the communities that we're in. So I think I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for the opportunity, Ntombi, and I look forward to questions and answers later on.
Thank you so much, Yumna. That was so inspirational. I like the story about the sewing of masks and how the lady just progressed from that to opening up more opportunities for herself. And I guess we see a lot of these stories, and these are the stories that needs to be put out there so that people of South Africa can actually know what these renewable energy projects, the kind of impacts we're making in communities. There's a lot of questions I'm seeing in the chat function. We're going to deal with them later on. Just to mention that at this point, we have 135 people on the call. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thanks, Yumna. We're going to move on to the next presentation by Hlengiwe Radebe from Globelec. Hlengiwe is going to talk to us about enabling high-impact enterprise development initiatives. And like Yumna said, there is integration between ED and SED. And Hlengiwe is an Economic Development Director for Globelec South Africa Management Services. She's responsible for social and economic development programs for all the South African assets of Globelec. And whilst overseeing Globelec's development division within the local communities of its power producing plants, she remains passionate about building sustainable partnerships with stakeholders. She's also a chairperson of SAWEA's Economic Development Working Group. She holds board directorships positions in 3 of Globelec's asset companies. And in her own words, she says, I have a strong belief in building and maintaining good and sustainable relationships based on win-win philosophy. in my interaction with people, I believe all parties can find what works for them in any situation. Very inspirational. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ntombi, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to share our experience as Cloud Black in terms of how we manage our economic development, especially to build sustainable enterprises in the communities that we operate in, and an opportunity to also share learnings, because there are definitely lessons that we've learned along the way. Maybe as a way of introducing, we can move to the next slide. A way of introducing the case studies that we've brought forward is to just maybe say, in terms of our working with small enterprises, we try and focus on women and youth-owned enterprises. In fact, we've actually gone out of our way to make sure that in 2 of the assets that we own and operate, we run youth-owned enterprises development programs that would be in Kimberley and in Limpopo, in 2 of our entities that we manage. I guess, one of the key learnings for us, if I can start with that, was to just try and remain consistent in terms of how we work with our communities, especially around how we approach the whole area of recruiting and getting people into the programs that we run. We try and be consistent, we try and be fair and open in terms of how we run the recruitment process, and we remain open to learning from other institutions. But what we've learned is that over time, if you remain consistent and the message remains the same, people begin to trust you, and we really enjoy a good working relationship now with our communities. If I can move on to the model that we use, the next slide. We try and avoid just throwing money in. We believe in building a partnership, whether we work with communities or we work with businesses. We believe in building partnerships. So the funding element will always be there. So I've spoken briefly about the recruitment process, that we go through a recruitment exercise where we look for the enterprises, we look for the entities that do some kind of work in the communities that we operate in. Funding is part of it, but funding alone doesn't really build a business. And we've learned that over time, that we will provide funding in terms of giving asset financing, working capital, and grant funding. But the important element for us that we actually have built into the program is that we structure a program over time. So we do have programs that last up to 3 years sometimes with an entity, depending on where we find them when we start working with them. So the business development aspect of the program is very critical in terms of what we do with entities. So the training and development, the business advice, the technical and legal support, we found that in most instances when we get involved with small entities, particularly in our communities, one of the challenges that have is the issues of compliance, just making sure that they get all of the compliance stuff right. And we then, look at the issues of social impact. I must hasten to say, we don't start with job creation per se when we start and start working with entities. Yes, job creation is important. We would like to see these entities start creating employment opportunities in the communities that they operate in. But at the beginning of the process, what we look for is more of efficiencies. How do we assist these entities to be more efficient, to create sustainable entities that will then in turn create job opportunities in their communities? We're also quite strict about health and safety. So one of the areas that we try and measure continuously is how safe the environment that these entities operate in, how much of their focus goes into ensuring a safe and healthy environment especially for employees in their operations. And also we try and align where possible to see if we can get entities that are green focused, that are in the green oriented industries. The last and again, an important element is that of market access and expansions. where an entity has shown, you know, that they are at the point where they should be growing, where they should be getting into other markets. So with the two examples that I've brought in to you know, share with the participants around how we do enterprise development, I will share some of the of the initiatives around helping SMMEs to access more markets. Sorry about that. So let's move to the next slide. Okay. So earlier on, I mean, Joshua mentioned that supplier development wasn't part of the compliance in the past, in the past bids, and only with the risk mitigation bid that we're starting to see supplier development. But already in GlobeLake, we had started identifying that opportunity, that there is an opportunity for us to start bringing in small suppliers into our value chain, and therefore support them as they get into our value chain. So the one example that I've brought in here, a case study of Phambili. We can move on to the next slide. Phambili is a woman-owned entity operating in the Northern Cape. When we first got involved with Phambili, they were just bidding for an opportunity for vegetation control and panel cleaning in the two assets that we own and operate in the Northern Cape. They'd been operating in Postmansbeek for some time, and they, you know, applied, or they sent through their bid for the contract. And we saw that as an opportunity for us to get in a woman-owned business into our value chain, but also support them in terms of their growth, but also, again, like I said, in terms of their efficiencies and how we can assist them to be more sustainable and grow as a business. So the company operates in two plants, Drogfontein and DR in the Northern Cape, and currently employs 23 people. When we first got involved with them, they had between 7 and 9 employees. At the time they were operating in the Postmansbeek area. When they moved to the two plants, they added their employees to a point where they're now sitting at 23 employees. That has created economic opportunities and income opportunities for people in our communities. So we, like I said, when I was discussing the model, that we do a lot of funding, which provides capital support, investment in the small businesses. So same with Phambili. We've, over the 2 years that we've been working with them, we've spent around 1.5 million supporting them in terms of making sure that they build their capacity. Considering that they work in two plants that are about 300 kilometers apart, it does require that they are well equipped to manage each site independently. So our focus has been on making sure that we assist them do that, and also to increase their efficiencies and their ability to also expand as they start looking for opportunities outside. What we've also done is we've allocated, over the 3-year period that they have the contract for, we've allocated a business development consultant whose job is to make sure that they manage their businesses in a profitable manner. This consultant is responsibility, one of the key responsibilities is around management accounts, ensuring that the financial management systems are in place, human resource management systems are in place, and ensuring that, you know, the owners of the business understand where the business is going and have a very clear business development strategy as the contract continues to mature with GlobeLake. So in terms of their growth, since we started working with them, when we started working with them, their turnover was about 1.2 million a year. They're now sitting at about 6.5 million a year, because what we've also managed to assist them with, like I said, one of the jobs and the critical deliverables for the consultant is to start helping them get employment, get opportunities outside of GlobeLake. You know, as it is now, they have one additional contract that they managed to secure in this very difficult year of 2020, where, you know, most people are losing opportunities. So it's been one of our, pride and joy to see this business being more efficient, offering employment opportunities to local people, but also just growing as a business and seeing the opportunity that exists and continue to grow in the Northern Cape for businesses like this, and seeing where this business could actually go into, in the future. Next slide, please. I guess some of the lessons that we've learned, in this journey, has been, again, this issue of providing funding and then stepping away. We realized early on, when we started working with this entity that, just giving funding and stepping away is not going to, get us very far. And we are not going to see the kind of development that we want to see in this entity. So we found ourselves getting more involved. Like I said, we've gotten someone that now does the mentorship and the training and assisting with the efficiencies in this business. Also, in terms of the line alignment, one of the challenges that we would face in some instances would be, when the IPP is going through a process at the particular point in time, and this entity is not supporting the business in terms of that, and just maybe deciding to stick to, this is the contract that I signed, and this is what it tells me I should do. So in terms of that, we found that it's very important that we ensure that when we bring in entities, especially smaller entities who may not have the kind of corporate exposure that would assist them in understanding the full business, that we assist them in trying to align themselves with what is happening in the business so that they continue to enjoy a good relationship with the business. Because, if you can, to stick to your contract, this is what I signed up for, and not flexible enough to accommodate what is happening in the companies, we found that that was one of the glitches that we found ourselves dealing with in this instance. Next slide. Also, another one was just dealing with the entrepreneur themselves. I think one of the lessons that we learned is, one of the things that happened in this space is people will start businesses and want to move on, start a business and want to move on to something else and not be involved personally in the business. What we found was, unless you insist on that kind of involvement from the owner of the business and not relying on supervisors and managers that are employed to manage the business, that the gap that is created there creates a bit of discord, that it also creates lack of commitment even within the employees themselves. So there was a time when we were battling with that issue, and trying to make sure that the owners of the business understand the importance of ownership and the identity that needed to be created around their business. I must say that we've managed somehow to bring them into the business and them understanding the importance of owning and the branding of the business being aligned to the philosophy and the values that they would like to see their employees implementing in the businesses that they run. So, in the recent months, especially with all the challenges that we've had around COVID and ensuring health and safety, it's been quite an important element to keep drilling into, make sure that the owners understand how important it is for them to remain focused and committed to their own business instead of starting a business and giving it to a supervisor to manage while they chase other contracts. Yes, it's important to expand the business. However, you need to build sustainability within this one before you are able to move on to the other one. So that was quite an important learning, and also an area of big support for us to assist them to understand the importance of actually owning and creating an identity for their businesses. So it's been a great learning on our part. I mean, it was not the first supplier development initiative that we did necessarily, but it was the first where we were so intimately involved to a point where we really even set ourselves targets in terms of seeing them grow, in terms of the contract and what they get out of the contract, as well as how the impact actually permeates into the communities that we operate in. Even during difficult times, when sometimes there isn't capacity as yet to manage people. For example, we would make ourselves available to try and assist and make sure that, industrial relations issues, for example, are addressed without any discord and any impact onto the communities, because they do employ people coming from our communities. If I can now move on to the enterprise development now, that does not link to the value chain of the company, where we then went out. I did mention earlier that in the Northern Cape, we specifically went out for a youth owned enterprise-driven kind of approach in terms of our enterprise development, which is something also that we picked up in our consultation with the stakeholders in the area of Kimberley, that most of the businesses are owned by young people, and young people require a lot of support in terms of building their businesses and creating value for the communities and for the entities that they started. So if we can move on to the next slide. We went through a process of recruitment, and I'll talk through the whole recruitment process towards the end of the presentation. But we set a specific criteria in terms of how we identify these entities that we'll be working with. So we were looking at people that have started operating, at least a year or 18 months to 24 months of having run their own businesses and gone through some of the teething problems that go with starting a business. And we went through bringing in the partners. It's a partnership program that we do with other partners that are in the space of small business development in the communities around Kimberley. So we're working with the NYDA, CEDA, NEF, and IDC. So the business that I'm going to talk about was one of the 6 successful businesses that received funding from one of the entities that we operate in Kimberley. So we went through about 15. There were about 15 entities that were shortlisted through a process that we were running with the key stakeholders that we worked with. So it's a pet grooming business, 100% Black, youth owned, and they needed investment in terms of, most of the businesses, to be quite honest, come through wanting money. We want money for this, we need money for that. Very few businesses actually come through saying, we need capacity building around this area. Most of them come and say, we need a car, we need that machinery. So that is why I said earlier on, our key requirement and criteria revolves around providing that kind of support, but also insisting on an ongoing support program that will ensure that whatever it is that we provide actually continues to operate, because we have had instances where we would provide capital investment in a business and only to hear a few months later that it's been sold because the business was no longer sustainable. So to ensure that whatever it is that we provide continues to support the business and give the kind of return that we were looking to support at the beginning of the transaction, we then decided we are going to stay with the business for as long as we feel it's required for the business to be sustainable. So we set ourselves targets. Like I said, we even give ourselves target to say, if we find an entity at this level in terms of the profit margins, this is the target going forward in terms of what we're looking to see the business achieve in a specific period. In this instance, we've given ourselves 12 months, but it's based on the potential that we've identified in the project and also the investment that we've already made, as well as what we have planned for the next 12 to 24 months. Next slide, please. I think one of the biggest lessons for us when it came to the enterprise development, especially working with young people, was that it was very important that we keep the recruitment process transparent. The way that we operated was we worked through the NYDA. the NYDA having a mandate already to work with young people, and also having some kind of a startup, what they call a seed funding for enterprises. We felt that, you know, they are a good partner for us to start with. However, what we didn't look at, you know, before going in is how transparent was the process in terms of the recruitment and getting everyone into the NYDA database. So that is the area that we feel going forward we can improve on. Also, I've mentioned in terms of collaboration, it's very important that we collaborate with the right people, the people that are already in the space, because they enhance the offering that you give to these entities. For example, working with CIFA, working with CEDA and the NYDA has, you know, enriched the program because they bring the various offerings that are required and are important in building sustainable relationships, sustainable businesses, sorry. I think the focus on the entrepreneur, I mean, I'm going to give a good example, which was a funny example for us as we were doing the assessment, because there were various businesses coming through. And the one that I'm presenting today, the pet grooming business, at first, when we saw their business plan, everyone was, oh, why are we dealing with animals? Why are we dealing with this? And there were so many reasons why people thought this business, you know, was not a suitable one to have been shortlisted. But at the end of the day, when they did their presentation, you know, we realized that the entrepreneur has done a lot of research. He knew his market, he knew his product, he knew exactly where he was taking his business, which we found quite refreshing. Because in most instances, when you do this kind of exercise, you find people who say, I just need a car. When you ask them, okay, what are you going to do with this vehicle that you're asking? They will not tell you how they intend using that car to bring more money into the business. They will not tell you how whatever capital investment they're asking for is going to build their businesses. So this we found quite refreshing when young people who knew their businesses in and out, you know, who could tell you exactly where the business is going, where the market is, how they're going to expand their market offerings, where they're going to work. So we found that quite useful. Another one was the last learning is, you know, allowing these entities to network and build linkages amongst each other. And a good example on this one is we have a biscuit manufacturer, you know, as one of the entities. And right now, the linkages that have been established is he's now manufacturing biscuits for the pets, you know, that he's now selling to this guy. The lady who's doing textile is now making clothes for the pets that now is selling to this guy. So that is also quite important so that they can learn amongst each other and also are able to link their businesses and build their businesses even further. So, I mean, it's a continuous learning process and we continue to learn, but we're quite excited with the caliber of the people that we're meeting in our communities. And we believe, especially in the youth and women, that we have a good material, if I can put it like this, to work with going forward in making sure that we make serious impact and inroads in developing our communities. Thank you, Dombi. I hope I was able to cover everything.
Yes, definitely. Thank you so much, Hlengiwe. I think all the stories that we are hearing today are so inspirational, where you're able to take businesses from the beginning and actually see them through and making sure that you handhold them and provide them the kind of support they need. And those are the kind of stories that we really like hearing. So thank you so much for your contribution. Can I encourage participants to please post your questions in the Q&A so that we can start going through the questions and prepare for the Q&A as we're having our last presentation now. Our next presentation, of course, you heard when Josh was presenting earlier on that local content is one of the requirements in the ED scorecard, and local content is really concerned with developing the local value chain. So to talk about localization of renewable energy value chains, opportunities for local investors, it's Francis Jackson. Francis holds a BSc in Mechanical Engineering from University of Toronto, Auckland University, and an executive MBA from the UCT Graduate School of Business. He's worked a lot in the wind industry in the development space. He's worked, for instance, developed Amakhala, Emoyen and West Coast 1 wind farms, and pioneered a portfolio of wind development assets in East Africa while working for WindLab. And as an investment principal at AIM, he dealt with ESG and asset management on several wind farm boards. He's also been very instrumental in setting up of the Atlantis Special Economic Zone while at the Green Cape. And he is now working on a project managing the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan. And I must also mention that at some point he was a chair of the technical working group of the South African Wind Energy Association. So as you can see that Francis has got a lot of experience in the renewable energy space, and we couldn't have found a better person to talk about localizing the renewable energy value chain. So thank you so much, Francis, for making time, and over to you.
Thank you, Ntombi. Hi, everybody. I think I must actually start off by giving credit to those who contributed to what I'm going to share with you today. This isn't all my work. There's a lot of people behind this, and one of my slides will share their pictures. So we can move on to what I'll talk about now. We'll talk basically about some definitions. What is industrialization? What is localization? And where am I going to focus in the next 15 minutes or so? And how does the IRP basically create a peg in the ground for the scale of our opportunity for localization? Then what are some of the things that we are learning in the process of working on developing the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan, as comes from the research and engagements with industry and the other social compact partners? What look like the low-hanging fruits for local manufacturing? And then if you're thinking about developing as a local manufacturer, what are some of the things you need to consider? Yeah, so here's the Green Cape Energy team and some of those contributing to the work on the South African Renewable Energy Master Plan. And I must make a nod to some of the people I see here in attendance who've contributed to our insights through interviews. And I'm sure you're going to find a lot wrong with what I have to say today, but that's part of what it takes to put together a stakeholder-driven plan development. Next up. So firstly, what are the elements of value chain, and how do we define localization and industrialization? On the right here, we have a typical life cycle of a wind energy project, where you see value chain phases from project planning through procurement, manufacturing, transport and installation, grid connection and commissioning, and O&M, and then ultimately decommissioning. These are all value chain components, and localization could refer to bringing any of these components into the local market, whereas industrialization would refer to core elements of that value chain, for example, in design, manufacturing, and servicing of the products. So I'm going to focus largely on components and the industrialization there, and given the time constraints, particularly on wind and solar. Next slide, please. Right, we often focus on the benefits of local content in terms of job creation, and our terms that we use there are confusing to some. Sometimes you'll see it, our most common metric in much of the literature around REEP is job years, right? Which to some people doesn't tell the whole story. And they'd like to know what's really headcount, right? What are the so-called real jobs? Look, job years is a very useful metric. It basically tells you how much work has been done, and it's a little different to jobs themselves. So just to be sensitive to how we use those terms throughout, here I'm going to just bring to your attention that the manufacturing part of the value chain, in an example, PV plant or wind plant, is 22% of the work done in the PV case, and 17% in the wind case. Onwards, please. Right. So the IRP. Look, let's let's take note that the IRP is a remarkable runway to bringing on a lot of renewable energy capacity. It's not an insignificant amount to be done, and if we can get that IRP rolling, we have a lot of potential for growth in the sector at many levels. In the early years, by 2015, on the back of the market confidence and the regular rolling out of those procurement rounds, we had seen a lot of progress already. Much of balance of plant was already localized, and there was manufacturing capacity set up in many components, including wind turbine towers, inverters, and PV module assembly. And then the hiatus in the procurement saw several of these investments pull out. So, for example, DCD Towers had their auctioning off of their equipment in April this year. It's tempting to think, well, we just need to pick up where we left off, right? But we won't be picking up there. We have to build up to 2015 levels first and then move on from there. And that means getting market confidence and also ramping up the capacity as we restart the industry, if you like. And what keeps coming through for everyone interested in investment in this market is continuity. We need to know that with certainty there's going to be this pipeline of demand. Next slide, please. So we've specifically had a well-established capability in lower tech utility scale wind energy components. Right now, we don't have enough capacity to serve the full annual build in the IRP 2019. So 1,600 megawatts a year would be too much for us to just jump straight into in terms of local components. Word from the market is that an OEM needs roughly 400 megawatts a year certainty to establish whether it's a tower manufacturer or a blade manufacturer or a nacelle assembly, and for several years. This could see 2 or 3 new wind tower manufacturers within IRP 2019 set up, for example, depending how much goes to steel, how much goes to concrete with batching on site and such. Now, in solar PV modules, there's actually a surprising amount of capacity for manufacturing crystalline silicon modules already. But most of this is in one OEM, while the other is a toll manufacturer. So that a toll manufacturer can manufacture for multiple OEMs. So there could be some more module manufacturing potential. But you've got to make that business case rational, and that could mean including consideration of regional markets, and we'll talk a bit more about regional markets as we go into the next few slides. Next slide, please. Right, so the first thing to be aware of, South Africa in the global market. So renewable energy value chains they're very competitive. We've got global value chain leaders who basically are the lead firms in the market, and we've got to be realistic about what export opportunities we might have if we're going to create sustainable business models on local and export demand and market share. There's interest in Africa. However, we've really got to get a good handle on what is the sub-Saharan African export potential. And in the past few years, many of the major markets have actually established renewable energy manufacturing capability. And the real ramp up in the past few years unfortunately coincided with our hiatus period, which meant there's a bit of missed opportunity there, and there's actually been a bit of an oversupply in the market that's been established for some major components, particularly in PV, in that period. We should make a nod to the fact that we've been quite busy on commercial and industrial solar in the meantime, which means we've got quite a lot of capacity to potentially export these services to the African market. And that could be a leverage point for local manufacturing of PV components. Next slide. Right, when we looked at comparator countries, we've done a bit of a sweep across many markets to see what the learnings are. There's 5 common factors that keep popping up. Firstly, the size of the local market and longer term visibility. I've said it before, I'm going to keep saying it again. Everyone keeps saying it again. We have to figure out how to make this implementable as a principle going forward, market certainty. There's been some form of local content requirements. Worth noting, though, that there are some exceptions to this. Denmark was one, and there've been some markets where, if you have enough market size, it's been enough to stimulate local content. And then industry support mechanisms from government, export aid, and leveraging the industrial strengths of the country. Next slide, please. Right, many interviews with OEMs and manufacturers are ongoing presently, and some of the emerging insights that I'll share with you now echo what's been said already here. So you don't want to necessarily put all your eggs on just the local market. It's helpful to have an export market as well to help make your business model sustainable. Labor costs are a consideration. And of course, location, logistics hubs are more favorable. If we can get into local nacelle assembly, this could potentially unlock opportunities for nacelle components to be localized. And then this echoes the ramp up question about civil and electrical balance of plant in particular. So there, with certainty in the market, we're going to have to ramp up again in skills and staff to be able to deliver the kinds of levels we were achieving by bid window 3. And also quite a strong call from the market to support moving from a value-based local content system, that percentage value that Joshua spoke about at the beginning, to a points-based system. And everyone wants it to be simple and not too complicated. Next, yeah. Right, so opportunities, these are the short-term or medium-term low-hanging fruit, if you like. Next slide, please. I'll speak specifically to industrialization and the manufacturing part there. So what's going to be a refrain through several of these is when you look through the value chain and you look through manufacturing of a component, when you start to look through to the materials that feed into that, it becomes quite interesting how we can make our local components more cost effective if we focus on cost effective material supply, and B, just generate growth in those. And steel is an interesting example. So, with IRP 2019, we could see local steel production increase some 5%, some 2.2 billion to GDP, and over 700 jobs. And then toll manufacturing as a model, I'll take you through the models just now, that allow production for more than one project or OEM. That's one way to mitigate this uncertainty in procurement that we face at the moment. Next slide. In wind, the most obvious still is additional wind turbine tower and tower internals manufacturing, and then local nacelle assembly. The assembly itself is a kind of high import, a high localization potential. But if we can get that going, it can trigger what's more medium potential, which is the components themselves. In solar, I spoke earlier about the additional module manufacturing. You'd have to look closely at your business case there. And then on the frames and structures, junction box, that kind of thing, if we can get our aluminium to be competitive with imports, we would then see knock-on expansion of everything that uses that aluminium. Next slide. Inverters is an area of opportunity, and I'll just highlight here the need to ensure that we can meet quality and certification requirements. This is typically a concern for those who would look to source such inverters locally. And then on mounting structures, so mounting structures do tend to lend themselves to localization because they're logistically, they require more effort to move around. However, they're not a large part of the value as a percentage in a solar installation. But here, steel and aluminium come up again for those. And cables, we need lots of cables. The cable suppliers in South Africa are already a large part of the value chain here. However, renewables isn't really part of their core business as it is right now, and we do face stiff competition from imported cables, particularly because of material costs. Next slide. Right, how would you do it? What would you consider if you were looking to invest in local manufacturing? Next slide. First, let's consider what would it take for an EPC or an OEM to actually change a supplier and take a new local manufacturer into their supply chain. So one of the most dominant means whereby global value chain leaders get their local component manufacturing established is the so-called follow sourcing model. So an international firm, the lead firm, would come in, establish themselves in the country, and then their existing suppliers come and set up there to supply to them. Even in the case where there might be alternative existing supply of such components, the switching cost is quite high. You require time, you require trust. It can take quite a long time just to get through the administrative burden of getting onto the database and to the procurement systems, and several years before they're comfortable with the quality of the supplier. And there may be certification requirements that are triggered for such changes to suppliers. Right, I won't dwell on each of these, but what you see here are 5 different models or typologies for setting up local manufacturing. They will, in various ways, suit different ways of meeting the needs of a particular value chain, and in various ways enable South African ownership or black ownership. The example of a local subsidiary would be the GRI tower manufacturing. So GRI has 25% black ownership in their South African subsidiary, and Seraphim. And the toll I mentioned before. So here you'd have a local manufacturer basically get license to supply for different OEMs. So Art Solar is an example of that. Local assembly, local partner manufacturer, or local manufacturing partnerships. These are all other models. Or you get the last one, they're fully South African local manufacturer. There we've got a fastener company. So don't discount the cable ties and the fasteners. Those are significant parts of this value chain. Right. It often comes up as one of several trade-offs that will emerge as we talk about localization and developing the value chain. That sure, you're welcome to require us to set up locally, but it's going to cost you. I think part of the work we really have to get a handle on now is establishing what does that really mean in practice, and how does it, when you draw your system big enough, thinking of the economy of South Africa, how does that really manifest as an impact? It's quite difficult to get an exact estimate of the price premium for across the whole spectrum of components, and it will also depend who you speak to. There's been some studies so far, 2013 and 2015, we had a reasonable amount of data, but everything has changed quite radically in the last 5 years, and we have, with funding from the South African Wind Energy Program, commissioned a piece of work to get better estimates on a component by component basis for what components are closest to being competitive or are already competitive in South Africa, and those which could become competitive if you give them sufficient economy of scale, which means, what would be the tipping points and how many megawatts demand there is per year, which would make them competitive. And there's some discussion that still has to evolve now around how you can structure your procurement process to minimize the impact of such price premiums. Considerations, for example, of the time period between financial close and COD come up in that. Next slide, please. So just be aware before you dive in, and there's been a few case studies of ventures that have fallen foul of these. What are some of the considerations? Firstly, finance and risk, right? When an IPP sets up and puts together their project structure and finances it, the manufacturers are typically required to put up significant bonds and guarantees. And in cases where there's been failures, serial failures, for example, that can be quite onerous, and putting up those bonds, once you've put together a few projects, that's definitely beyond the balance sheet of many developing industry players and indeed many financiers locally. So that might be an area for innovation. And then, because you've got to take into account your equity partners aren't going to want to carry such bonds and guarantees themselves. And when the equity and debt providers evaluate your project risk, they're going to go, right, who's in your suppliers? And what does that mean for project risk, and what does that mean now for the terms of our equity and debt? And then when you take into account your ramp up time, you've got to basically have 2 different scenarios. Your first scenario is, are you premising your business case for setting up your factory on around one project, or are you making a strategic call based on the pipeline, the whole market size, and your estimate of how much market share you're going to get? If in the former case, you've got to consider timing carefully, right? So when you're actually going to trigger your factory build and kit out, is it on preferred bidder status, financial close, notice to proceed, such that you can then deliver before COD? I think we've got one nice example of where that was done very effectively, was the setup of the GRI tower manufacturing through the work of the Atlanta Special Economic Zone and the City of Cape Town. That from concept to the first tower rolling off the production line took 11 months, which is pretty impressive. Not everyone would be prepared to bank on the likelihood of that happening in each case. So that takes us back to the ideal would be for people to make a call based on the full market size, and that's usually where the OEMs are looking, not project by project or bid by bid. And for that, we need to understand that there really is certainty for this rollout. Next slide. Okay, so just to summarize, the point here is rolling out the capacity in the IRP. There's really has a remarkable opportunity for industrialization and the supporting economic recovery. When that is viewed by the spectrum of people in South Africa and stakeholders to the energy industry, it's seen as actually imperative for it to come with commensurate growth in local value chain industrial capacity. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jackson. I think that's going to trigger a lot of questions from the audience, especially with regards to local content requirements and really opportunities available for local investors. I think at this point, I'm going to hand over to Nivesh Govender, who's the COO of the SAPVIA, to take us through the Q&A and then take us to the close of the session. Thank you very much, and over to you, Nivesh.
Thank you very much, Ntombi, and thank you to the speakers for very informative presentations. I think it's completely interesting. And the fact that we've managed to keep majority of the audience throughout the session just shows how important these presentations are. So thank you for that. And thank you to the audience for sticking with us. There are a few questions, and I'm just going to go through them with each of you, if you don't mind. So maybe just to start with the easy ones. Yumna, there's a question from Bilal that says, where can they access the SCATEC development programs?
Thank you very much. Yes, I saw that. Thank you very much, Bilal. I think you can, maybe it's a question back, are you wanting to access it as a beneficiary, as one of our partners, to be a service provider? So either of those, I think maybe let's please be in touch with me, and I can provide my email address, and we can look at, and I can redirect you from whichever perspective you are looking at that. So if it's a service provider, we've actually done a big ad at the beginning of the year calling for partners, which is seeing us through this year and possibly next, but there are always new niches that people are providing to us that we might be interested in. So that's an answer if you're looking from a service provider perspective. If you're looking from as a beneficiary, you need to be in one of our communities. But if not, again, let's open up the conversation and see if you have any exciting opportunities to offer for us to talk about.
Thanks, Yuma. Another question for you was from Irfan. His question says, what social value contributions do you consider that the community investment projects will produce? Are we able to see social value or the change that these projects generate?
I think that's a very important question. And I think that is very difficult to measure, I think, from a social perspective versus an economic perspective. From an economic perspective, we can look at jobs, or as you spoke about, Francis, job years or job days. We can look at profit, we can look at turnover, we can look at cost management and efficiencies, as Lingiwe has mentioned. But from a social perspective, these are more difficult to measure. So we've actually are developing our monitoring and evaluation framework. And depending on the social intervention, we've got a different set of short, medium, and long-term metrics to be able to measure that. So I'll give you a little example linked to one of the case studies that I spoke about in the presentation. So with regard to the stakeholder engagement forums, the SEFs, there you'd look, for example, in terms of just the short term, our outcome, a social value, have we built leadership in the community? Have we built an understanding of governance, professionalism within these SEF conveners? And to there, we just ask very simple questions. Do they meet regularly? Do they have a terms of reference? Are they keeping minutes? And these very simple proxies give us an understanding of governance, of structure, of process, of professionalism. And then moving into the medium term, we might then be asking the questions of these SEFs. What are the quality, the level of sophistication of projects that are proposed? How are these projects managed? How are the funds of these projects managed? And then we'd be looking at the M&E of those projects themselves. So that is a bit of an insight into the social aspects. But again, as I've said, social is a little bit more difficult, a little bit more slippery to manage rather than the economic. I hope I've answered your question, Irfan.
Thank you very much for that, Yumna. As we've heard, Yumna's details will be available. It will be in the post-event email that's sent out to all participants. So for those that need to get in touch with her, they can do that through that channel. Shlingiwe, let me come to you. There's a couple of questions. One from Landiwe. Landiwe wants to know, are there benchmarks or thresholds for job creation component of the socio-economic impact?
There isn't a benchmark or threshold necessarily. I think that the benchmark would be when you compare like to like. For example, if you compare a project in a particular space in terms of how it has progressed, and then you get a project in the same space and saying, if an entity that has a revenue and profit margin of this much, can create 2 or 3 job opportunities, it means a similar kind of entity operating in the same space with the same kind of revenue and profit would then be in a position to offer the same kind of job opportunities. However, there isn't a threshold, that we work with. We do try and benchmark with, the like, compare to see what the potential of the business in job creation is, but there's not necessarily a threshold or, that we give to entities to say, this is what you have to achieve. Like I did mention, that our focus becomes more on sustainability and building the business to be more sustainable than to force employment onto the entities before they are even ready to carry people.
Thanks for that, Shlingiwe. There's another question from Maloba. I think it was for Josh, but I'm hoping that you'll be able to answer it. So Josh's presentation talked a lot about beneficiaries in terms of Black-owned businesses or Black-owned companies. Does this also extend to youth and women-owned businesses, or is it just Black-owned businesses?
Josh.
No, Shlingi, Josh is not with us, so I'm hoping that you can answer.
Okay, no, definitely. If we look at, in any case, the industry requirements in terms of our compliance, yes, Black ownership is important, but especially when you look at on the economic development side, we do have quite a strong focus on women-owned. And like I said, we went out, with a very clear intention of attracting young people in some of the programs that we're doing in the communities. So yes, there is, a deliberate focus on women and young people in some of the areas that we operate in, but also sometimes you are informed by the fabric of the community that you're working in. If there's enough material, again, for the lack of a better word, if there's enough material to work with, whether you are a woman, man, if there's enough material and there's a compelling case to bring people into this space, we definitely do go out. But the question is, young people and women, definitely we will go out and attract, especially women and young people.
Thank you for that, Shlengi. Yumna and Shlengi, there's a lots of appreciation for your presentation. So thank you so much. And I hope you're soaking in the good comments. It's so nice to see the good comments because we usually see such bad comments in terms of what renewable energy is doing. So it's really encouraging to see the change of perception and the appreciation that, that you guys are getting for the work that you do in the communities. Francis, I'm going to move over to you. There's a few questions in terms of localization, industrialization, and local manufacturing. So the first one is from Frank. Frank has a view that local manufacturing does not create many jobs, does not have the economies of scale required for manufacturing, and based on past or based on history, has low quality of locally produced products that were coming out of the market. His question is, should we focus on reliable, low-cost electricity, thereby creating more jobs in the economy rather than focusing on localizing renewable energy, thereby increasing the price of these renewable energy projects and the power that's being output?
Thanks, Frank. There's a few assertions in that question, and then it falls on me to try to refute or respond to several in one go, which I will no doubt fail to do properly. But if the first is several claims about the quality locally, no insufficient economies of scale, not enough jobs to make it worthwhile. Look, I think some of that's all under debate presently, and we will know better what is the current state of play for components as of 2020 compared to what we saw in 2013 and 2015 to be able to say which ones really will be competitive or not, given the scales we see in IRP 2019. But the one important point you raise, which I can talk to as one of the trade-offs that we need to get a handle on, is the kind of polarized view that on the one hand, what we should be gunning for is lowest cost at all costs, and thereby to stimulate the economy through low cost electricity versus possibly higher cost electricity while stimulating local industry and the jobs and economic impact of that. So I'd be interested to know, Frank, if you have numbers to back up an assertion that the one is better than the other. We don't presently have such numbers that are definitive enough to say, well, go for low cost at all costs. But I know it's not a popular view amongst many of the stakeholders in the country to simply gun for that on its own, and we would like to see ways to use this IRP to see economic impact on different levels coded into it. We are exploring what is that holistic system-wide economic impact. You know, your gross value add from having local manufacturing versus your GDP impact from price. So all I'm going to say, Frank, is those are interesting questions. I don't have the full answer for you in numbers. If you have some numbers, please send them to me, and we'll take them into account in our considerations now.
Thanks, Francis. I'm going to do one bit. I'm going to facilitate a meeting between you and Frank so you guys can discuss and we can take forward on the master plan. Another question by Terence Creamer. Terence Creamer is directing this question to you, Francis. He's asking, when will the master plan be finalized? And by when do you expect that the plan will start influencing the rebid documents? So just to answer the second part is that as the associations, we are already engaging both DTIC and the IPP office on future rounds, so the bidding rounds that are coming and the documents that are coming out. So I know SAPVIA and SAWEA are both in these discussions, but maybe the first question for you, Francis.
I think I can quickly talk to the second part. It's everyone's hope that bid window 5 comes out before SARAM is finalized, before the Renewable Energy Master Plan. So that means that we really don't want to see the conclusion of the master plan on the critical path for bid window 5. And I know that the IPP office is working very hard on that. And I know that many of the discussions around, including what you've referred to now Innovation, are informing what the IPP office is doing right now. So, on the Renewable Energy Master Plan's timeframe, the target date for a draft of the master plan would be the first quarter, well, the March next year. That's what the component of it that we have under our control. Now, the way master plans work is they're effectively a social compact that needs to be adopted and championed by industry, labor, and government. And so there's a part of that that isn't under our control, and that's what plays out after the draft starts to be debated in the Executive Oversight Committee and so on, which could see it run who knows how long after April. So I can only talk to the part that we're gunning for, which is delivery of the draft by March. Perhaps one way it could play out pragmatically is that there's low-hanging fruit. There's clear things in the first phase or first scenario, which refer to the IRP, that can be adopted and implemented first off, and we can work on a kind of a ratcheting basis to lock in clear elements of the plan as we go. That's a potential thinking of how to be most efficient about this.
Thanks, Francis. I see there's a question from Meliswa. Meliswa says it would be of benefit to look at another aspect that impacts the renewable industry. Meliswa, if you can just please clarify for us what aspects you're talking about so I can get the presenters to respond to that. In the meanwhile, Francis, and I think Ntombi, I'm also going to put you on the spot a little bit here. There's a question from Johnson that says there were local manufacturers and DCD wind towers being one of them. What will happen to these manufacturers who have already closed their doors? And we've seen a lot of PV manufacturers as well, or assembly plants have closed doors. So where do we build in space for these manufacturers that have gone through this already? Francis, if you want to take a first stab, and then Ntombi can add.
Sure. Look, many of them closed under different conditions and in different ways, right? So how they respond to this pause, if you like, is going to depend on what they've done. If they've gone into insolvency, or they've simply packed up stock and put their tooling aside, that, if they've done that, they might just be waiting with everything on ice for conditions to look promising again, and then they can set up again. So I know, some of the module assembly guys, they've got a bunch of kit that they could immediately pop up, not immediately, but with a relatively quick setup time, get going again. Or you could look at the guys who bought up most of DCD Towers tooling and equipment, who they could be holding it on ice for conditions. There's some who simply, they've set up a local shop, then they've pulled out. For them to come back in, we really have to consider the fact that we almost have to rebuild trust that we had at the start. There was a lot of confidence and optimism in 2011, which some of these guys who've come in they've been stung, they've been burned, and now need us to go further to rebuild that confidence and to start up. And that's what I was referring to when I said, we're not starting off where we left off at 2015. We know now what can go wrong, and we really have to build conditions to make things favorable in a way that builds that confidence before they'll step back into the market. But basically, for each one, if they've got their business case on ice, they're going to be looking for the conditions to look favorable, and it's going to be on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks for that, Francis. And Ntombi, you want to add?
Yeah, maybe to add to that, I totally agree with Francis. It will take a lot of building trust, especially from the investor side. I've spoken for a long time with Johnson about the DCD issue, and I think it's an issue of it was a failed investment. The investors saw that it's difficult for them to continue operating and accumulating overheads while there is no business. So opening another tower factory, there is a huge opportunity from the wind industry to do that, because we have one tower factory in Atlantis, and if you look at the capacity that needs to be procured annually, I think it almost warrants that someone needs to invest. But if we do get a new tower factory, it will be a completely new investment. It may or may not be in Port Elizabeth. It will depend on the conditions, on whoever is seeing the opportunity to invest. But I do believe that there is an opportunity for someone to take up a challenge and invest in that. And we're currently talking to the IDC. Their investment appetite in local manufacturing is renewed. They are looking for opportunities. And I think once they find the partners, they will definitely look into investing in a second tower facility.
Perfect, thank you for that. Just another plead from Johnson to say that they would really like to see DCD wind towers reopen for the job creation potential in the Eastern Cape. There is a question from Vehan, but I'm not completely understanding the question, but I think it's been addressed by both Yumna and Hlengiwe in terms of how you get access to these projects and how you can be a beneficiary out of the projects. So I think with that, Ntombi, it wraps up the questions that we have received. Maybe just a few closing remarks before we close the session. So again, thank you to all the presenters and all the speakers. I think the ED platform, Joshua, has set the scene for us in terms of the Renewable Energy IPP Procurement Program scorecard requirements. He spoke about the 7 elements, which are jobs, local content, ownership, management and control, procurement, enterprise development, and socioeconomic development. And more importantly, he spoke about the skills transfer requirements, the requirement for increased employment. So we can see that the intention of what the DMRE and the IPP office has set out is very empowering in nature. And they've also put in good control mechanisms to achieve what they set out to achieve. From both our colleagues at SCATEC and GlobalEC, they talked about high impact projects, both SED and ED projects. Yumna went into strategy talk in terms of how we build strategies and frameworks, how we collaborate with beneficiaries and communities, and how we think big to make more impact out of these projects. And she spoke about the mechanisms that SCATEC is using, whether it be SEFs or CIDP within SCATEC to achieve this kind of outcome. Whereas GlobalEC and Hlengiwe spoke about case studies, particular case studies, and the learning that were coming out of those case studies over the years. And then we ended off today's session with local content. And I think it's very important, Francis, for defining localization versus industrialization. And people often use this interchangeably. And it's clear from the definitions that there is a difference between the two words. So you spoke about the localization of renewable energy value chains specific to wind and solar PV, industrialization versus localization. You spoke about policy enabling manufacturing, specifically the IRP and the rollout over the next 10 years. We heard about the opportunities that there are for manufacturing, particularly across wind and PV sectors, and what people should consider when they are looking at local manufacturing. And I think that then wrapped up the session very nicely in terms of the key opportunities and the key spaces that people should be looking at from a developmental angle and a developmental point of view of how to participate more in the renewable energy sector. So thank you very much for that. And just a last shout out to our partners, the IPP office, BEPA, the Black Energy Professionals Association, and REEF, the Renewable Energy Entrepreneurs Forum of South Africa. Our series sponsors, Mainstream Renewable Power and UV, and our sponsor for today. Thank you to our friends at ED Platform. And that's me. Thank you, Ntombi.
Thank you very much, Nivek.
Thank you very much, everyone.
While we're saying goodbye to the participants, there's a question in here that actually made me giggle from Emmanuel that says, where do men over 45 who have started their solar companies should go for help to develop their companies. It's like the focus is only on women and youth. So these established women on the panel, do you guys want to take a stab at that?
You see, the thing of gender diversity, you start neglecting men while focusing on women.
No, I did say we don't turn anyone away. We don't turn anyone away. So I did talk about the material. If we